They sold her 11 acres of drowned grass in a cottage with no roof, and they charged her 1 shilling for it. Lady Whitfield counted the coin twice, as if a shilling from a steward's granddaughter might somehow be short. "The wet land suits your family," she said. Loud enough for the land agent to hear, loud enough for the clerk to hear, loud enough to carry. Ellen Ward said nothing. She signed where the agent pointed, took her copy of the conveyance, and walked out of the estate office into the rain. But what Lady Whitfield did not know, what her son Sir Henry did not know, what nobody living in that corner of Somerset knew, was what the old steward had buried beneath the cottage floor in the winter of 1921. And the shilling that was meant to be an insult would prove, in time, to be the finest bargain struck in that county in 100 years. Settle in with us for this story, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Ellen Ward was 35 years old, and for all practical purposes, she was alone in the world. She had no husband to provide for her, no family left to receive her, and no home to return to. What she had was a cardboard suitcase, a bookkeeper's neat handwriting, and £41 saved from 11 years of adding up other people's money in a Bristol shipping office. Her mother, Ada, had died the autumn before, quietly, in the 2 rooms they had shared above an ironmonger's shop. It was not a tragedy. It was simply an ending, the kind that arrives without drama and leaves without explanation. And when it was over, Ellen found that the city held nothing for her at all. The office would replace her within the week. The landlord had already shown the rooms to a young couple. In Bristol, she was a lodger, a wage, an entry in someone else's ledger. There was only one place on earth that had ever felt like it belonged to her, and she had not seen it in 17 years. Ashcombe, a village of gray limestone and green water meadows, folded into the low country west of Taunton, where the fields lay flat as a table and the willows stood along the ditches like patient old men. Her grandfather had been land steward there for 40 years, steward to the Whitfield family of Whitfield Hall, in the days when the hall had 30 servants and the home woods were full of pheasants. Samuel Ward. She could still see him if she closed her eyes. A tall man, gone stooped, with white whiskers and black boots, and hands that could mend anything on the estate from a gate hinge to a grieving widow's accounts. He was not a warm man in the way that storybook grandfathers are warm. He did not carry sweets in his pockets. What he carried was better. He carried certainty. When Samuel Ward said a wall would stand, the wall stood. When he said a field would flood, the men moved their sheep, and the field flooded. Ellen had been born in the steward's cottage at the edge of the low meadow in the last year of the Great War, 5 months after a telegram came to say that her father was gone. Michael Ward, her father, had gone to France with the Somerset Light Infantry in 1915 and had died on the Somme without ever seeing her face. Her mother used to say that Ellen had her father's eyes. Her grandfather never said it, but sometimes, when she was small, she would catch him looking at her across the lamplight, and he would look away and clear his throat and tell her to fetch the ledger so he could teach her the columns. That was how he loved, in lessons. I taught her to keep accounts before she was 10, not play figures, but the true accounts of a working estate, wages and seed corn and the price of tar. He taught her that a ledger never lies, but that men lie to ledgers, and that the difference between the two was where all the trouble in the world came from. He taught her to walk a hedge and read it like a page. He taught her that a drain is a promise made underground, and that a promise kept in the dark is worth 10 made in the daylight. And he taught her about the low meadow, 11 acres of it, lying below the cottage, between the withy beds and the old church path. Other men called it wasteland, for as long as anyone in Ashcombe could remember. The low meadow had drowned every winter and sulked wet every summer, growing nothing but sedge and rushes and mosquitoes. The estate had given up on it before the war. The village boys caught eels in it. The village mothers warned their children away from it. But her grandfather would stand at the cottage gate in the evening, looking down at that sheet of gray water with the sunset on it, and he would say the same words, always the same, the way other men said grace. Low land is the best land. Nell, remember that, when the water goes. Low land is the best land in England. The river has been paying rent onto that meadow for 1,000 years. One day somebody will clear the drains, and then they will see what has been lying under the water all along. She was 18 when he died. In the spring of 1935, he was buried in Ashcombe churchyard beside her father's name, which was carved on the memorial cross because there was no body to bury within a month. The new agent had wanted the cottage for a gamekeeper. Ellen and her mother had packed what they owned into a carrier's cart and gone away east to Bristol, to the 2 rooms above the ironmonger's, and the door of the steward's cottage had been locked behind them. 17 years. A war had come and gone. The gamekeeper had never moved in, because within 4 years there were no more pheasants and no more shooting parties, and precious little left of the old estate at all. The cottage had stood empty, the roof had gone, and the low meadow had gone on drowning. Winter after winter, patient as ever, keeping its own counsel under the water. Now, in the cold, wet April of 1950, Ellen Ward came back, she told herself. On the train from Bristol, that she was only coming to tend the graves. She told herself she would put flowers on her grandfather's stone and touch her father's name on the cross, and take the evening train back to a city where nobody knew her. That was the plan. It was a sensible plan, and she was a sensible woman, and she abandoned it within an hour of arriving. Because she walked out along the church path, past the withy beds, and she saw the cottage. It stood at the head of the drowned meadow, like a shipwreck. The thatch had fallen in years ago and taken half the bedroom floor with it. The windows were blind sockets. Elder bushes grew out of the parlor. The garden wall her grandfather had pointed and repointed every autumn of his life had slumped into a green ruin, and nettles stood shoulder high where her mother's washing line had been. It should have broken her heart. She stood at the gate in the rain and waited for her heart to break. Instead, something else happened, something she could not have explained to anyone in Bristol. Looking at the ruin, she did not see what it was. She saw what it had been, and beneath that, like a watermark, she saw what it could be. She saw the hearth swept and the fire drawing. She saw glass in the windows and a light behind the glass. Her grandfather's voice came up out of 17 years of silence, dry as ever, patient as ever. A house is only a promise. Nell. Stones above, drains below. Keep the promise and the house keeps you. She stood at the gate for a long time. The rain went down her collar. Out on the low meadow, a heron lifted off the floodwater and rode away slow across the gray sky. And Ellen Ward, 35 years old, alone in the world, sensible, made the least sensible decision of her life. The estate office was in the west wing of Whitfield Hall, and it had not changed. The same green door, the same smell of ink, dust, dubbin, and damp plaster, the same long counter where her grandfather had paid out wages every Friday of her childhood, counting the coins into hard palms, calling every man by his name. But the estate behind the office had changed, and Ellen only needed the walk up the drive to read the whole story. The lodge gates were tied shut with wire, and she had come in through the side. The parkland was let for grazing. The great avenue of elms had gaps in it, like a jaw losing teeth, where timber had been sold standing. The hall itself was shuttered along the whole east front, and grass grew in the gravel at the door where 3 gardeners had once raked every morning before 8. She knew the signs. Anyone country-born knew the signs. In those years, 2 wars and 2 rounds of death duties had gone through the great estates of England like a scythe, and the Whitfields, who had never been rich so much as they were grand, had been cut down to a thin remnant of what they were. Half the farms sold. The servants gone to factories. The son of the house, Sir Richard, had died the previous year, and the taxes on his dying were said to be beyond anything the family could raise. Ellen had heard all this in the village shop within 10 minutes of asking. She had not needed to ask twice. In a village, the great house is the weather. Everyone can tell you what it is doing. She had come to the estate office intending something modest. She would ask to rent the cottage, the way cottages were rented to plain working people all over England. She had her £41. She had references from Bristol. She had rehearsed the words on the church path. She never got to use them, because Lady Whitfield was in the office when the agent showed her in. The dowager, the old baronet's widow, mother of the new Sir Henry. A tall woman in good black cloth gone slightly green with age, with rings loose on thin fingers, and a voice trained by 40 years of committees to carry to the back of any room it was in. And Lady Whitfield remembered her. The steward's granddaughter. She said, it was not a greeting, it was a filing. She said it the way one reads a label on a box before deciding which shelf the box belongs on. Ellen said, good afternoon, and said her name, and began her rehearsed words about the cottage, and got no further than the rent before Lady Whitfield turned to the agent, a stringy, careful man named Mr. Crane, and had one of the ideas that rich people in trouble are so often proud of. Rent it, Lady Whitfield said. Rent it. One does not rent a ruin. Mr. Crane, One is sued over a ruin. The roof is in the parlor. The meadow is a swamp. The insurance men have been tiresome about that swamp for years. She looked at Ellen then, up and down, the suitcase, the mended gloves, the good plain coat on its fourth winter. No, she said. If the Wards want to come home, let them buy their home. Sell her the cottage in the low meadow, all 11 acres of it, freehold as it stands, water and all, for a shilling. Mr. Crane began to say something about the surveyor, and Lady Whitfield spoke over him the way a woman steps over a puddle. A shilling, she said, and she takes it as it lies, flood and nettles and liability entire, and the estate is shot of the whole miserable corner forever. Her eyes came back to Ellen and rested there, pale and satisfied, and she said the words that the clerk would repeat in the Bell Inn that same evening, the words that all of Ashcombe would have heard by church on Sunday. "The wetland suits your family," Lady Whitfield said. "Your people were always at their best in the mud." There was a silence. The rain ticked on the office window. Mr. Crane looked at his boots, and the clerk looked at his inkwell, and neither of them looked at Ellen, and in that silence Ellen Ward understood, with perfect bookkeeper's clarity, exactly what was being sold in that room. Not land, a humiliation. The shilling was not a price, it was a full stop, set at the end of her family's 40 years of service, and she was being invited to pay for it herself. Her grandfather's voice, dry as sacking, out of the dark of 17 years. "Never argue with a ledger. Nell, let the ledger argue for you." Ellen opened her purse. She found a shilling. She laid it on the long counter where Samuel Ward had counted out 10,000 honest wages, and she looked at Lady Whitfield with a face that gave that lady nothing at all to keep. "Done," Ellen said. The conveyance was drawn up within the week, because the estate solicitors were eager for any business that ended a liability. And there were smiles behind hands at the Whitfield estate solicitors in Taunton at the tail of it. 11 acres of standing water, a roofless cottage, and every obligation attaching thereto, transferred entire and forever to Miss Ellen Ward, spinster, of no fixed abode, in consideration of the sum of 1 shilling. Lady Whitfield counted the coin twice. She would have done better to count what lay under the cottage floor. But she did not know it was there. Nobody knew it was there. It had been waiting in the dark for 31 years, wrapped in oilcloth, patient as the meadow, and it was worth more than everything the Whitfields had left in the world. The first night, she slept at the Bell Inn, because there was nowhere in the cottage where rain did not reach. The second night, she slept in the cottage anyway. She had spent the day making one room whole, and the room she chose was the kitchen, because the kitchen had the hearth, and the hearth wall was the oldest and strongest wall in the house. Her grandfather had told her once that the hearth was built 200 years before the rest, that the cottage had been raised around an older chimney the way a pearl is raised around grit. The stone slabs of the kitchen roof, laid by men who did not trust thatch so near a flue, still held. The window was gone, but a window is only a hole, and a hole can be boarded. She bought what she needed in the village shop, and the buying of it was her first lesson in what Ashcombe now thought of her. The shop was kept by Mrs. Cole, a small round woman with flour on her forearms and opinions everywhere else, and Mrs. Cole served her tea, candles, bread, cheese, nails, and a galvanized bucket in a silence you could have leaned a ladder against. The silence was not unkind. It was worse than unkind. It was sorry for her. At the door, with the bell already ringing, Mrs. Cole finally spent 4 words, the way a careful woman spends money. "That's a sad place," Mrs. Cole said. It was, Ellen agreed, and let the door close behind her. Because pity, her grandfather had taught her, is an account that only ever pays out once, and she did not intend to draw on it. What she intended, she hardly knew herself yet. She only knew the order of things, because he had drilled the order of things into her on 100 wet mornings. Roof before walls, walls before glass, hearth before comfort, drains before everything. She was 35, and she had a bookkeeper's hands, and the first week nearly finished her. She cleared the kitchen alone, barrowing out rubble and rotted thatch and the sad wet bones of her mother's old dresser, and her palms blistered. And the blisters broke, and she wrapped them in strips of shirt and went on barrowing. She boarded the window. She swept the chimney with a holly branch on a rope, the way she had watched it done as a child, and stood back black as a collier while 40 years of jackdaw nests came down in a soft, filthy avalanche. When she finally lit a fire in her grandfather's hearth, on the 4th evening, The flue drew as sweet and strong as it had drawn all through her childhood, and she sat on an upturned crate in front of it, filthy, aching, alone, and watched the flames take hold, and found that she was smiling. The chimney had kept its promise. Stones above, now for the promise below. She went at the meadow the way her grandfather would have gone at it, not with a shovel, with her boots in her eyes. For 3 days she walked it, or walked what could be walked, skirting the flood, reading the ground. And the ground, to a woman raised on Samuel Ward's lessons, was a page written over many times but never quite erased. She found the old main drain where he had always said it ran, along the west headland under the willows. Its brick mouth at the river end sagged and choked with 30 years of silt and root. She found the stone culvert under the church path, blocked solid, she found, greened over and half sunk in the sedge, the cast-iron sluice gate at the river, seized with rust, its winding gear long gone, and on the frame of it, under the moss, her thumb found letters. She peeled the moss back. Sabao, 1901. I had set that sluice with his own hands the year before her father went for a soldier. The estate had let it drown. But iron in Somerset mud does not die, it only sleeps. And Ellen Ward stood in the rushes with her thumb on her grandfather's initials and declared, to a heron and to nobody, that she was going to wake it up. The village thought she was mad. There is no gentler way to say it. And Ashcombe did not look for a gentler way. A woman alone, in a ruin, in April, talking of draining the low meadow that had drowned since before the Kaiser's War. The men in the bell gave her till haytime. Mrs. Cole gave her till Whitsun. The vicar, Mr. Ames, a young man with an old parish, called at the cottage to make sure she was not actually starving, found her 40 feet up the west headland in the rain with a drag fork, cutting rushes off the line of the old drain, and went away with his hat wet and his opinions rearranged. It was old Noah Tanner who changed everything in the 3rd week. Noah Tanner was past 70, a ditcher and drainer all his working life, one of the last men in the parish who had learned the trade before machines. He had worked under Samuel Ward as a young man. Now he lived with his daughter at the far end of the village, sat in the sun when there was any, and was generally agreed to be finished. Ellen met him on the church path on a Tuesday morning, leaning on a blackthorn stick, watching her fight the culvert, and he watched for the better part of an hour without a word, which in Somerset is a form of conversation. Then he came down off the path, slow as church, took the fork out of her hands, turned it round, and gave it back the other way up. You're pulling. Noah Tanner said, rushes is drawed, not pulled, draw and twist, see, like so. Your granddad would have had my hide, letting a Ward stand in a ditch holding iron like that. He stayed the morning. He came back the next day, without discussion, wearing his working boots, and after that he simply came. Every day the weather allowed, and Ellen learned not to thank him more than once a week because it made him testy. He could no longer dig, not truly, but he could see. And what Noah Tanner could see underground was worth 3 strong men on top of it. He knew where the old drains ran because he had cleaned them as a boy. He knew which lengths would have held and which would have gone. He knew, above all, what the whole village had forgotten and what Ellen had only half understood. The low meadow, he told her, was not drowned because it was low. Half the parish was low. The low meadow was drowned because it was abandoned. Your granddad drained this ground true, he said, sat on the culvert head, filling his pipe with slow, ceremonious fingers, drained it and kept it, sweet as a garden, till the year they let him go on without so much as a boy to help him. Land like this is a clock. Made, somebody must wind it. Estate stopped winding, that's all. Weren't nothing wrong with the clock. And piece by piece, mostly sideways, in the manner of old men, he gave her the village's memory of her own family, the parts she had been too young to understand. How in the winter of 1921, the West Somerset Agricultural Bank had failed, and half the district with it, farmers' savings gone overnight, and how the Whitfield estate itself had stood within a whisker of going under that year, though the gentry's troubles were kept behind the hall's shutters where village eyes could not price them. How something had happened that winter that nobody ever quite got the bottom of. Some arrangement, some quiet rescue, and the estate had staggered on. And how, in the middle of all that ruin, old Samuel Ward had done the one foolish thing of his life. He had given up his back wages for a rent-free life tenancy of the worst 11 acres in the parish, the cottage and the swamp, his for as long as he lived, and not a day longer. That's what they said, Noah Tanner told her, eyes half shut over his pipe. Said the old man had gone soft at last, took the swamp and the cottage for his portion when he might have had money, and money short as it was that year. Sir Charles let him have it quick enough. Mind. Quick as that, and your granddad never said one word about it to any living soul. Not why, not wherefore. Just stood at his gate of an evening looking at the water. I asked him once, straight out, why he done it. Know what he said? Ellen waited. Out on the flood. The wind turned the water all one way, like a hand smoothing a gray cloth. He said, low land is the best land. Noah Tanner said, that's all. Low land is the best land, Noah, and a man must bank somewhere. Then he laughed. Only time I ever heard Samuel Ward laugh, and I worked beside him 30 years. I've thought on it since. Odd nights. A man must bank somewhere, and the bank just gone bust. You see, I always did think he was telling me a joke I couldn't see the shape of. Ellen looked out at the water and said nothing. But something moved in her then. Some bookkeeper's instinct. The small, cold click of a figure that does not sit right in its column. She had been a child here. Children accept the world as given. Now she was 35, and she had spent 11 years learning exactly how money moves and hides and lies, and she stood looking at her grandfather's drowned meadow and thought, for the first time in her life, that it did not add up. A steward of 40 years standing, in the year of a bank crash, with wages owed to him, takes 11 drowned acres instead. A proud family, drowning in debts, lets their best servant go with a swamp for a pension, quick as that. Either her grandfather had been a fool, and nothing in her whole remembered life said he was a fool, or the meadow was not what he had been banking. She did not say this to Noah Tanner. She filed it, the way she filed everything, neatly, dated, to be carried forward, and she went back to the culvert and drew rushes till dark. May came in warm, and the work found its rhythm, and the rhythm began, quietly, to gather people to it. It happened the way such things happen in villages, not through words, but through witness. Ashcombe walked the church path on Sundays, and from the church path the whole of the low meadow lay open to inspection, and week by week, Sunday by Sunday, the parish watched the impossible being done in installments. The west drain opened, chain by chain, a dark clean cut through the sedge, the culvert under the path cleared, so that for the first time in living memory, the water beneath it could be heard moving. A low, secret gurgle under everyone's Sunday boots, and children knelt to listen to it and were hauled up by their collars. Bert Hollis, the carrier, began it. He had carted her lime and boards from Taunton twice, cash on the nail, and the third time, unloading. He stood looking at the drain a long while and then said his father had helped cut that drain as a boy, under her granddad, and that his father had always said there weren't better set brick in Somerset. Then he spat on his hands and gave her the rest of the afternoon, free, on the culvert, and went home wet to the waist. Then it was the Luckett brothers, small farmers from the parish edge, whose own ground drained into the same brook and who had skin in the game. Because a cleared main drain lowered water 3 fields away, they came with proper tools. Then one of the young Coles, sent by his mother with a basket, officially to deliver bacon, in fact to report back, and he stayed 2 hours and returned home with rush cuts on his forearms and an account of the work that did Ellen more good in the village than a year of church attendance. And Mrs. Cole's silence broke, all at once, the way ice breaks, and behind it came a spring flood of talk and warmth and unasked advice, and a heavy cake every Friday, and the information, delivered sternly, as if Ellen had disputed it, that the Wards had always been respected in this parish, always, whatever some might say who sat up at the hall counting other people's shillings. Because the story of the shilling had gone round, of course. Ellen had never told it. The clerk had told it, the same evening, in the bell, and Lady Whitfield's words had been repeated in every kitchen in Ashcombe with that particular Somerset relish for a thing, said by gentry that would have earned a smacked head from any decent mother. The wet land suits your family. Ashcombe had turned the sentence over, examined it, priced it exactly, and put it away in the parish's long memory, in the drawer where such things are kept. And without anything being said, without anything needing to be said, the village had come to a verdict, and the verdict was that it would be a fine thing, a proper thing, a thing worth wet boots, if the swamp the old witch had sold for spite turned out to be worth something after all. Ellen learned all this the way she learned everything now, sideways, through Noah Tanner's pipe smoke. "They're not helping you." "Made," he told her, "comfortable. watching Bert Hollis and the younger Luckett wrestle a willow root the size of a pig out of the drain mouth. Don't you go thinking it. They're helping the story. A village must have a story, see? Same as a fire must have a draft. You're the best one this parish has had since the lightning took the church spire. And that were 1907. By midsummer the drains were open from the church path to the river, and everything now waited on the sluice. The sluice was iron, and iron was beyond drag forks and goodwill. The gate had stood seized in its frame for 30 years, rusted to the guides, and behind it the whole weight of the meadow's water leaned patiently against the river wall. Ellen spent £3.10 of her dwindling money on paraffin, penetrating oil, new bolts, and the hire of a chain jack, and the last Saturday of June. Half the men of the parish came down to the riverbank as if to a fair, with crowbars and opinions in roughly equal number. It took 4 hours. They soaked the guides and jacked and swore and soaked again, and the gate groaned like something in the Old Testament and gave a 1/4 inch and stuck and gave an inch and stuck, and then, at 3:30 in the afternoon, with old Noah Tanner directing from the bank like a bishop and every man streaming sweat, the gate of Samuel Ward's sluice broke its rust all at once and rose shrieking in its guides, and the low meadow began, after 30 years, to pour its heart out into the river. The water went brown, then black, then clear. It ran all that day and all night, and Ellen sat up half the night listening to it, the deep, steady voice of it through the boarded window, the sound of a promise being kept underground. It ran all the next week, slackening as the meadow gave up its long hoard, and the flood shrank in from the edges day by day, and what rose out of the shrinking water, acre by acre, silenced even the bell. Land, black land. Not the sour gray glay of a spoiled marsh, but deep, crumbling, coal-black alluvium, the hoarded wealth of 1,000 winter floods. River silt laid down season over season since before the conquest and kept moist and mellow under its blanket of water like something wrapped in a cellar. Noah Tanner walked out onto it when it would first bear a man's weight, sinking to his ankles, and took up a handful and crumbled it and smelled it, and stood there so long with his eyes shut that Ellen thought he had been taken ill. Then he said, quietly, not to her, to the meadow, or perhaps to a man 30 years dead, you knew that, you old devil. You knew all along what you were sitting on. Lowland is the best land, when the water goes. They got a late crop of potatoes into 2 acres of it that same summer, because potatoes forgive haste, and what came out of that black ground in October made men whistle through their teeth clear across the market at Taunton. The Luckett brothers begged the seed halm offer for their own trials. Mrs. Cole put a card in the shop window, Ashcombe potatoes, low meadow grown, and sold Ellen's crop at a halfpenny over market and was proud as a duchess about it. By the time the first frosts came, Ellen Ward had money in an account at Taunton, a sound roof of good slate on the kitchen wing, glass in 2 windows, a bed, a table, a lamp, and standing in the parish a thing she had not owned since childhood, which was a name, Miss Ward, of the Low Meadow, the steward's granddaughter, who had bought a swamp for $1 and been laughed at, and had drained it in a season and been proved. And then came the Harvest Festival, which was the day Ellen Ward understood, once and finally, that she had come home. Harvest Festival in Ashcombe was older than anyone's memory of it, and it kept its old shape, the church dressed to the rafters, with sheaves and marrows and bread plaited like rope. The whole parish in its stiff best, and afterward the supper in the tithe barn, trestles end to end, and everyone in their long-settled places, because a village supper has a geography as fixed as its fields. Ellen had meant to slip in at the back of the church, as newcomers do, and had her hand on the rearmost pew when old Noah Tanner, scrubbed and collared and nearly unrecognizable in Sunday serge, took her by the elbow with a grip that allowed no discussion and walked her, past every turning head in Ashcombe, the full length of the aisle, to the 3rd pew from the front on the north side. The Ward pew, the steward's pew, where Samuel had sat under the same window for 40 years, where her father had fidgeted as a boy, where she herself had swung her short legs on 100 Sundays before the world took it all away. It had stood empty. She learned afterward, not by any rule, but by the parish's own unspoken bookkeeping, 17 years of Sundays, because Ashcombe does not reassign a pew any more than it reassigns a grave. Noah Tanner stood her in front of it and said, in a whisper pitched to carry to the porch, "Well, sit down then, maid, you're holding up the harvest." And the church breathed out somewhere behind her, a soft parish-wide sound between a laugh and something else, and Ellen Ward sat down in her family's place and looked at her hands and did not hear one word of the sermon. At the supper afterward, they put her between Mrs. Cole and the elder Luckett, which in the geography of the tithe barn meant something, and everything on the tables had come off the parish's own ground, and in the center of the top table, in the place of honor usually kept for the biggest marrow of the year, somebody with a sense of history had set a plain white dish of potatoes, low meadow potatoes, boiled in their skins, steaming, black earth washed off them and their flesh gold as candlelight. The vicar, Mr. Ames, said Grace, and then, being young and braver than the parish gave him credit for, he added to it, he said, and for land restored, and for promises kept underground, and for those who keep them, we are thankful. Nobody looked at Ellen. Everybody looked at Ellen. Mrs. Cole pressed her hand under the table and blew her own nose like the last trump. And old Noah Tanner raised his cider mug half an inch off the boards in her direction, the fullest public speech he had made in a decade. Her grandfather had a saying about villages, one she had not thought of in 20 years, and it came back to her whole that evening in the lamplight of the tithe barn. A village is a long ledger, Nell. It carries every kindness forward, and every cruelty too, and it always balances, only slower than a man can wait. He had not lived to see his own entry carried forward, but he had known it would be. That was what the saying was for. On the hill above, behind its shutters and its wired gates, Whitfield Hall watched and said nothing, but it had seen. She caught sight of Mr. Crane, the agent, twice that autumn, once on the church path, once stopped in the estate trap on the Taunton Road, looking down at the black acres and the new slate roof with the expression of a man doing sums he does not like. The shilling had been meant as a full stop. It was turning, before the county's eyes, into a question mark, and somewhere behind the shutters of the hall, Ellen was quite sure, Lady Whitfield had begun to feel the special fury of the spiteful, which is spite that has been made to look like bad judgment. Ellen let her feel it. She had a winter to prepare for, and a second window to glaze, and one more task, long promised, before the hard weather came. The kitchen floor. She had left it till last deliberately, the way one leaves the sweetest job as wages for the rest. All summer she had lived on her grandfather's old floor as it stood, the great gray flagstones sunk and tilted by decades of neglect. And now, in the quiet of November, with the meadow resting and the village gone indoors, she meant to lift them, level the bed beneath with sand, and lay them true again, so that the heart of the house should be as sound as its roof and its drains. It was proper work for dark afternoons, 1 stone a day, prize, lift, level, relay. On the 4th afternoon, she came to the hearthstone itself, the wide slab before the fire, the stone she had stood on 10,000 times as a child, the stone every ward foot had crossed for 40 years, and she set her bar under its edge. And it came up sweeter than any stone yet, too sweet, riding up out of its bed as if it had been lifted before and never fully settled since. And it had been beneath it, where there should have been packed earth and sand, there was a shallow chamber, lined with slate, dry as the inside of a drum, and in the chamber, square and quiet and patient, lay a tin deed box, army green under its dust, wrapped twice over in oilcloth, with the wrapping tied in her grandfather's unmistakable knots. Ellen Ward knelt on the floor of her kitchen in the November dusk, and the fire ticked beside her, and the meadow lay silent below the window, and she looked at the box for a long moment before she touched it. Then she said, aloud, alone, in the empty house, "All right, Granddad, show me." The knots gave to her fingers the way his knots always gave, instantly, to anyone who knew the trick of them, and to no one else on earth. Inside the oilcloth, the tin, inside the tin, dry as the day they were laid there, in the order of a man who had filed documents for 40 years, a bundle of papers tied in legal pink tape, a smaller packet in a foolscap envelope, a flat leather pouch, and, on the very top, where it could not be missed, a letter, one word on the face of it, in the strong upright hand that had taught her own hand its letters. Nell. She did not open the letter first. All her life she would wonder at herself for that, and all her life she would know it was his training in her fingers, because Samuel Ward had taught her that in any account you verify the figures before you read the excuses. She untied the pink tape. The first document was thick parchment, engrossed in a law clerk's copperplate, and its heading ran, "This indenture of mortgage, made the 14th day of March, 1908, between Sir Charles Whitfield, Baronet of Whitfield Hall in the county of Somerset, of the one part, and the West, Somerset Agricultural Bank of the other part." She read on, slowly, translating the law language into a bookkeeper's plain figures as she went. The bank had advanced Sir Charles the sum of £8,000, and as security for that £8,000, Sir Charles had charged, mortgaged, and assured unto the bank the freehold farm known as Home Farm, Ashcombe, with its farmhouse, buildings, yards, orchards, and 410 acres of land, the same being more particularly delineated on the plan annexed. Home Farm, the heart of the estate, the one farm the Whitfields had never sold, could never sell, because Home Farm was the estate now, the last working limb of the whole grand body, the rents and milk and corn that kept the hall's remaining chimneys smoking. Her hands were very steady, bookkeeper's hands. She set the mortgage down and took up the second document, and the second document was short, and it was dated the 9th of February, 1921, and it was headed Transfer of Mortgage. The West Somerset Agricultural Bank, in liquidation, acting by its duly appointed liquidator, in consideration of the sum of £1,500 paid to it, hereby transfers and assigns unto Mess R.S. Prentice and Lowe, solicitors, of Taunton, as trustees for an undisclosed private client, all that the before recited mortgage, and all principal moneys and interest thereby secured, and all rights, powers, and remedies of the mortgagee thereunder, to hold the same upon the trusts of a declaration of even date. Ellen read it, and frowned, because it was not what she had begun to expect. Not her grandfather's name, a firm of lawyers, holding for a client with no name at all. For one strange moment the whole shape of it wavered in front of her, and then her fingers found the next paper in the bundle, a single folded sheet, its edge still bearing the broken halves of a red wax seal, and the wavering stopped forever. It was headed, Declaration of Trust, dated that same 9th of February, 1921, executed under seal by both partners of the firm. And it said, in 3 lines of copperplate that had waited 31 years in the dark to be read, that the mortgage and all monies secured thereby were held by Messrs. Prentice and Lowe as bare trustees only, for the sole benefit of Samuel Ward, of the Steward's Cottage, Ashcombe, land steward, his heirs and assigns absolutely, whose name was to be disclosed to no person whatsoever during his lifetime except at his own written direction. Ellen read it twice. Then she sat back on her heels on her grandfather's kitchen floor and understood the full workmanship of the thing. The way one understands a drain by seeing where it runs hidden. The lawyer's names on every public record, his own name under seal. In the dark, beneath the hearthstone, Sir Charles could have searched the register till doomsday and found only the name of a respectable Taunton firm looking back at him. Nobody could follow the money home, because the money had no home on paper. It had only a hearth. And then she looked into the fire, and 31 years rearranged themselves around her in the lamplight. He had not been paid off with a swamp. He had never been the estate's fool, nor its pensioner, nor its charity. He had been its creditor. In the black winter of 1921, when the bank failed and its liquidator was selling every asset it held for whatever cash could be got, quickly, quietly, at ruin prices, somebody had bought the mortgage on Home Farm, £8,000 of secured debt, gone for £1,500, because in that winter nobody in Somerset had £1,500, and a debt against a drowning estate was worth what a drowning man's coat is worth, and the somebody had been the steward, the servant, the man in black boots at the long counter. Samuel Ward had walked into the wreck of the bank with everything he possessed in the world, and had come out holding the deed to his master's survival. And then, for 31 years, through his dismissal, through his exile from the cottage, through his death, through everything, that deed had lain here, under the hearthstone, under the feet of the family, in the dark, and he had never once called it in. And beneath the declaration lay yet another paper, and this was the one that made her sit very still, because this was where her grandfather had stopped buying a debt and started building a clock. It was headed Deed of Postponement and Capitalization, dated that same 9th of February, 1921, and made between Sir Charles Whitfield of the one part and Messrs. Prentice and Lowe, as trustees for their private client unnamed, of the other, by its terms. The mortgage monies were not repayable on demand, nor on any fixed day, but only upon one of two events, whichever should first occur: any attempted sale or further charge of Home Farm, or the death of Sir Charles's heir, and until that day, whenever it came. The unpaid interest was to be added at each year's end to the principal, and secured with it, and compound accordingly. Ellen read it 3 times, and each reading gave her more. Sir Charles had signed it gratefully, no doubt, in the ruin of that winter, a deed that asked him for nothing, not a payment, not a farthing of interest, for as long as he or his son held the farm, and let it be. He had gone to his grave believing some mild stranger in Bristol held his debt and had forgotten it. He had never understood what he was signing, because what he was signing was patience with a mechanism in it. The debt could not lapse, could not expire, could not be barred by any statute of limitation, because until the family themselves tried to sell, or until Sir Richard died, it had not even fallen due. It did not age, it only grew. Samuel Ward had built the debt to sleep for a generation, and to wake, at compound interest. On the one morning the Whitfields tried to sell the ground from under the parish. The foolscap envelope held the accounting, because of course it held the accounting. He would no more have left a sum unexplained than a gate unlatched. A single sheet, ruled in his own hand into the columns he had taught her before she was 10. Legacy of Sir William Whitfield. Received 1902, kept whole $500. She knew that name from the churchyard. Old Sir William, Sir Charles's father. The baronet, her grandfather, had first served as a young man. So the old lord had left his steward £500, and the steward had never spent a shilling of it. Gratuity and insurance. Michael. Received 1917, kept whole 6 and Ellen put the paper down for a moment. Then her father's death money. The price the world had paid for a sergeant of the Somersets left on the Somme, and her grandfather had never touched it, not through any of the lean years she could remember, the years of mended boots and turned collars. It had sat whole, waiting, until the winter a bank died, and then he had spent his dead son to save the living land. Savings, 40 years 390, total $1,500, and beneath the total, one line, not figures, the only line of explanation on the sheet, pressed deep into the paper as if the pen had been held very firmly. A man must bank somewhere. The leather pouch held the practical remainder, his copy of his will, everything to Ada, and after Ada to Ellen. All my property whatsoever and wheresoever, the receipt for the £1,500, stamped by the liquidator, and folded small. A cutting from the Taunton Courier, February 1921, reporting the bank's failure, with one sentence underlined in pencil. The liquidator confirms that the bank's securities are being realized, and that certain of its provincial mortgages have been acquired by private clients through the agency of Messrs. Prentice and Lowe, solicitors, of Taunton. Prentice and Lowe, not the Whitfield solicitors at all, but the separate Taunton firm named in the newspaper, cutting the firm whose strong room held the counterparts, the registered memorials, the whole armored legal proof of everything under her hands. He had built it like he built a drain, brick and brick and brick, and every course true, and all of it underground. Then, and only then, she opened the letter. Nell, if you are reading this, then you came home, and you lifted the hearthstone, which means you laid the floor true, which means you are the woman I supposed you would be. Good. I will keep this short, for the fire is low, and I am old, and you have the deeds beside you, which say most of it better than I can. In the winter of 1921, the bank failed, and the estate stood to fall with it. For the mortgage on Home Farm would have been sold to strangers, and strangers would have foreclosed by Lady Day, and the Hall could not have stood a month after Home Farm went. I did not do what I did for Sir Charles, who was a weak man, though not a wicked one. I did it because 40 years of this parish's wages, and its cottages, and its old men's last years, hung off that estate like fruit off a wall, and I could not stand at my counter and watch the wall pulled down. And I did it for another reason, which I will own to you. Since a ledger must balance pride, they would never take help from a servant's hand, so the servant's hand helped them without their leave, and they have lived on it since without knowing. And there has been a joke in that these many years, which was sometimes all my supper. I never called in the debt, and while they let your grandmother's grave and your father's name alone, I never would. But I know the family. Nell. I served 3 generations of them, and the metal runs thinner in each casting, so hear me. If you are reading this, the odds are they have done it again, to your mother, or to you. some small cruelty, done from a great height, because the height is all they have left. If they have, then everything in this box is yours, to use as you judge right, and I put no condition on it, save one: whatever you do, whatever they offer, however the account is settled, if the low meadow has come into your hands, by whatever road it came, keep it, never sell it, never trade it, never let it go. The meadow is not money. Nell, the meadow is ours in every way that matters. Your grandmother is buried in sight of it, and your father learned to walk on it, and when the water goes, and one day somebody with our name will make the water go, it is the best land in England, and our right to live upon it was earned honestly, at a price, and the price is entered in the book. The debt is real. The interest has never been paid. You were always quicker at compound figures than I was. Amuse yourself. Learn the bones, keep the promises, and be kind where kindness is deserved, which is most places, though not all. Your grandfather, Samuel Ward, written at this table, Michaelmas, 1934. The fire had burned to red embers before Ellen moved. Outside, over the drained meadow, a tawny owl called and got its answer, and the river ran quiet in its walls, through her grandfather's sluice, obedient to a dead man's brickwork, and Ellen Ward sat on the true-laid floor of her kitchen, with 31 years of silence in her lap, and did the compound figures in her head. Because he was right. She had always been quick at them. And they were not figures so much as they were a verdict. £8,000 of principal. Interest at the deed's rate. 5%, capitalized at each year's end under the deed of postponement, principal feeding interest and interest feeding principal, year over year, 31 years. She did it longhand twice, by candle, to be sure, and the answer came out the same both times, the way true answers do. The far side of £36,000, secured, first charge, on home farm and every acre, buyer and brick of it, and home farm at 1952 prices would not fetch 12. The Whitfields did not own home farm free and clear. They had not owned it free and clear for 31 years, for every acre of it stood pledged to the hilt and past the hilt. They farmed it, dined off it, drew their last consequence in the county from it, by the unclaimed grace of the man they had let go with a swamp, whose granddaughter they had lately sold that swamp to, for a shilling, with a sentence attached that the whole parish had by heart. The wetland suits your family. Ellen looked into the embers a long time. She thought of her mother in the 2 rooms over the ironmonger's, turning collars. She thought of Lady Whitfield counting the coin twice. Then she put every paper back in its order, tied the pink tape, closed the tin, and set it on the mantel shelf above the hearth it had slept under, and went to bed. And slept, they say, the sleep of the just, though it may only have been the sleep of the balanced ledger, which for a Ward was much the same thing. She was in Taunton by 10 the next morning, at the offices of Prentice and Lowe. Old Mr. Prentice was dead, but his son was living, a dry, precise man of 60 who received her with ordinary politeness, glanced at the papers she laid before him with ordinary attention, and then sat quite still for the better part of a minute, looking at them, with the expression of a chess player who has just understood, several moves too late, the game that has been played across his own board. Then he rose, without a word, went out, and came back carrying a japanned deed box, old, dusted for the occasion, and set it down, and Ellen read the painted label as he turned it to face her. Ward est a private client, one. It is all here, Mr. Prentice said, and his dryness had gone soft at the edges, the way dry men go when they are moved and have no practice at it, the counterpart transfer, the registrations, my father's attendance notes. I articled in this firm in 1919, Miss Ward, and I remember the week in 1921 when your grandfather came to us. I was told nothing. Then, my father kept this box in his personal strong room 30 years and told me only on his deathbed what it held, and made me swear the firm would hold it until a Ward came asking. He paused, and squared the papers, and said, in the tone of a man closing one book and opening another, I must tell you, Miss Ward, that your visit is timely, remarkably timely. I had a letter this Tuesday past from the solicitors to the Whitfield estate. What Mr. Prentice told her that morning, across the deed box, was the other half of the story, the half that had been happening up at the hall behind the shutters while Ellen was draining a meadow. And it was a story as old, by 1952, as England itself. Sir Richard Whitfield had died in the spring of 1951, and the Crown had presented its bill. Death duties on the estate, assessed, argued, appealed, and confirmed, and the figure was ruinous, because the figures always were, in those years. That was what the figures were for. The Hall could not pay it from income, for there was no income worth the name. It could not pay from savings, for there were none. There was only one asset left in the Whitfield name large enough to meet the bill, and every man in the county could name it without looking up from his plow. Home Farm. Through the autumn, quietly, the estate solicitors had been arranging its sale, and they had found a buyer, a syndicate out of Bristol, money made in war contracts and looking for land, and the price was agreed, and the duties would just be covered, and the Whitfields would keep the Hall and its gardens and its name, shorn now of every acre that had ever earned a shilling, but keep them. Contracts were to be exchanged by Lady Day. All that remained was what always remains, the investigation of title, the lawyer's slow crawl through a century of deeds to prove the seller owns what he sells. And in the second week of that crawl, the buyer's solicitors had found it. On entry in the register, 31 years old, a mortgage, dated 1908 for £8,000. First charge on the whole of Home Farm, transferred. February 1921, out of the wreck of the West Somerset Agricultural Bank, to Messrs. Prentice and Lowe, solicitors of Taunton, as trustees for a private client, never discharged, never satisfied, never, so far as any record showed, so much as a shilling of interest paid upon it, from that day to this. You could not sell Home Farm, Mr. Prentice explained, folding his hands. While that charge stood, no buyer would complete. The syndicate's lawyers had, in his phrase, declined to proceed pending clarification, and the Whitfield solicitors, in rising alarm, for Lady Day was 7 weeks off, and the Crown does not wait, had needed no detective work at all to know where to turn, for the register itself told them the charge stood in the name of Prentice and Lowe, trustees. So they had written directly to the firm, one increasingly desperate letter, asking the only question that mattered. For whom do you hold the Home Farm mortgage, and what will your client take to release it? I had not yet replied. Mr. Prentice said, I was bound by my oath to my father until a ward came asking, and no ward had come. He looked at her over his spectacles, and something that was not quite a smile happened at the corners of his dry mouth. You came asking on Thursday, Miss Ward. I received their letter on Tuesday. I have been in the law 40 years, and I do not believe in Providence, but I confess that this week has shaken me. He laid it out for her then, plainly, the whole shape of her position, in the manner of a man who has decided that his client shall want for nothing in the way of understanding. The debt was good, secured, registered, alive, and beyond the reach of any statute of limitation, for under the deed of postponement, it had fallen due only at Sir Richard's death the year before, so that the law's clock, which bars a stale mortgage after 12 years, had scarcely begun to tick. Every quibble had been anticipated and answered 30 years since by a steward who built in law as he built in brick. Principal, 8,000, interest, capitalized year upon year under that same deed, upward of 28,000 more, against security worth, at a fair 1952 valuation, perhaps 11,500. She could demand payment in full, which was impossible, and foreclose, which was simple, and Home Farm would pass to her by order of the court, and the Whitfields would then face the Crown's bill with nothing left to sell but the Hall itself. And the Hall, unsaleable, unheatable, mortgaged to its chimneys, in a country that was pulling such houses down at the rate of one a week, would finish them, completely, name, seat, and consequence. 180 years of Whitfields in Ashcombe, ended by a steward's granddaughter inside a 12-month. Or, Mr. Prentice said, and stopped, and let the word stand there. Or, Ellen agreed. She looked past him, out of the tall Georgian window, at the roofs of Taunton in the rain. She thought about her or grandfather's letter, the one condition, and the last line before his signature. Be kind where kindness is deserved, which is most places, though not all. She thought about how carefully he had written that, a man who never wasted words, leaving her the judgment whole, not all, but most, she thought, longest of all, about what he had actually done in 1921, the shape of the act itself. He had held absolute power over that family for 31 years, and had used it to do precisely nothing except keep their roof over them, and their pride whole and their cruelty unanswerable. That had been his choice, and it had cost her mother a home, and Ellen had turned it over every way in the firelight, and she had concluded, at last, at 2 in the morning, that it was not meekness and had never been meekness. Power held and never spent does not spoil. It compounds. He had known exactly what he was leaving under that hearthstone. He had left her the whole accumulated fortune of his restraint, 31 years of 5% upon forbearance, and one instruction only: keep the meadow, and the rest, Nell, is yours to judge. Write to them. Ellen said, tell them the holder of the charge is found, and will meet Sir Henry and Lady Whitfield at Whitfield Hall on Friday week to settle the account. There was a fortnight of quiet lawyer's work first, and Mr. Prentice did it with the thoroughness of a man discharging a 30-year trust. Samuel's will was traced and proved, and Ada's after it, the short, sad grant of a woman who had owned almost nothing, and the chain of the beneficial interest was made fast, link by link, Samuel to Ada, Ada to Ellen, and then, the trust's last duty done, the firm executed one final deed, transferring the legal charge itself out of the names of Prentice and Lowe and into the name of Ellen Ward, so that for the first time in 31 years, the register and the truth said the same thing, and the mortgage on Home Farm stood vested in a Ward as absolutely in law as it had always stood in justice. Only when every link was tested did he draw a sheet of paper toward him. And might I know, he asked, pen poised, in a tone that suggested he had already guessed and merely wished to hear it said, what terms I am to prepare? Ellen told him. He wrote for some time. When he had finished, he read it through twice, and then he took off his spectacles and polished them, unnecessarily, at length, and said, finally, in the voice of a dry man moved past his practice for the second time, in one morning I attended your grandfather in this room, Miss Ward, when I was an articled clerk. He sat where you are sitting now. I will say only that I believe he would consider the account correctly drawn. They came to the meeting believing they were meeting a syndicate. That was the detail Ashcombe would relish longest. In the years of telling that followed, the detail Bert Hollis would always lean on when he told it in the Bell. The Whitfield solicitors had been informed only that the charge holder's representatives would attend at the hall on Friday at 11. Sir Henry had spent the week composing himself to face Bristol money, some hard-eyed board of war profiteers come to pick the estate's bones, and had resolved, his mother at his elbow, to be gracious, to be firm, to appeal, if all else failed, to the traditions of the county. At 11 o'clock precisely, Mr. Prentice was shown into the library of Whitfield Hall, dry as ever, a japanned deed box under his arm, and behind him came Ellen Ward. She had thought carefully about what to wear, and had understood, in the end, that it did not matter, and had come as she was, in the good plain coat on its 5th winter now, with her grandfather's tin under her arm, and stood in the great cold shuttered room where the carpets showed the ghost squares of furniture long sold, and watched the Whitfields understand. It took Sir Henry several seconds. He was a heavy, unfinished man of 40, not clever, not wicked, the thin last casting of the metal, and he looked from Prentice to Ellen and back with the honest confusion of a man waiting for the real meeting to begin. Lady Whitfield understood at once. Ellen watched it reach her, watched the pale eyes go from the solicitor to the deed box, to Ellen, to the tin, and watched 31 years of arithmetic complete itself in a single terrible stroke behind that composed old face. Because whatever else she was not slow, and the sum of a steward who takes a swamp for his wages in the very winter a mortgage vanishes into private hands is a sum that needs doing only once. You, Lady Whitfield said, it was barely sound at all. Mr. Prentice laid out the documents on the long library table, one by one, in order, with a valuer's neutral voice, the indenture of 1908, the transfer of 1921, the deed of postponement, with Sir Charles's own signature upon it, which Sir Henry stared at as at a ghost. The probates, Samuel to Ada, Ada to Ellen, the compound account, itemized by year, 31 lines each a little heavier than the last, the figure at its foot underlined once in red. He spoke for perhaps 4 minutes, and no one interrupted him, and when he had finished, the silence in the library of Whitfield Hall was of a quality that the room had never held before in 180 years, the silence of a house hearing, for the first time, what it was standing on. Sir Henry read the account's final figure 3 times. His lips moved on it. Then he sat down, abruptly, uninvited, in his own library, and said, to no one, In a small, flat voice, "We can't pay that. No one could pay that." "No," Ellen said. It was the first word she had spoken. No one could. My grandfather knew that when he wrote the rate, it was never set to be paid, Sir Henry. It was set to be understood. She opened the tin then, and took out the letter, and read them the middle of it aloud, standing at the end of the long table in the cold light, the bank, and the winter, and the £1,500, and where the £1,500 had come from. The 500 kept whole from old Sir William. The 610 that was the price of her father. She read it level, in her bookkeeper's voice, the voice for figures, and it was Lady Whitfield who could not keep still under it, who turned her rings and turned them, and at the words gratuity and insurance, Michael, kept whole, made a sound, one sound, quickly stopped, that Ellen did not look up to interpret. "I did not do what I did for Sir Charles," she read. "I did it because 40 years of this parish's wages hung off that estate like fruit off a wall. And I could not stand at my counter and watch the wall pulled down." She folded the letter and put it away and closed the tin. "That is who held your house up," Ellen said, "for 31 years. A servant, with his dead son's money, in secret, because your family would have starved sooner than be beholden to him. And he knew it, and he spared you the knowledge. You lived on my father, Lady Whitfield. Every dinner in this house since 1921 was eaten on my father, and my grandfather let you eat in peace, and asked for nothing, ever, except 11 acres of water that nobody wanted. And when I came back, with nothing, and asked to rent his cottage, you sold me his meadow for a shilling, to make a lesson of me in front of your clerk." She let that stand in the room. Nobody moved. "The wetland," Ellen said, "suits my family. You were quite right. It always did. You never once asked yourself why." What happened next was the part of the story that Ashcombe could never quite agree on, in all the years of telling, because it was the part that did not go the way such stories are supposed to go, and yet no one who heard it ever wished it otherwise. Sir Henry, gray to the lips, asked what she wanted. He asked it simply, with his hands flat on the table, and there was in the question a kind of relief that was almost childlike, the relief of a weak man who has spent 7 weeks in dread of an unknown creditor, and now at least beholds a face. "Name it," he said, "whatever can be raised. If you must have the farm, then, God help us, the farm." And Ellen said, "I don't want your farm, Sir Henry." The room went still again, differently. "I have thought about what I want for a fortnight," she said, "and I will tell you what I decided. And Mr. Prentice has it drawn, and you may take it or leave it entire, for I won't bargain. My grandfather never called in this debt because calling it in would have pulled down the parish along with you. The rents, the cottages, the old men's last years, his words, not mine. That has not changed. Home farm sold to a Bristol syndicate is home farm farmed by a manager for a balance sheet, and every family in those cottages turned out or squeezed inside 5 years. I drained a meadow this summer with the help of half this village, and I'm not going to repay them by handing their roofs to a syndicate. So, here are the terms." Mr. Prentice slid the engrossed deed across the table, and Ellen spoke its contents plainly, in the voice for figures. "Item. The debt is discharged in full, principal and interest, every penny, this day, forever. In exchange, home farm is conveyed, not to me, but to a trust, the Ashcombe Land Trust, newly created, to hold the farm entire and unbroken. Its rents to be fair rents, set by valuation, not by need. Its cottages never to be sold from under their tenants. Its income, after upkeep, to the parish, the school, the almshouses, the church roof, so long as the trust endures. Item. The Crown's bill, the trust, holding the farm free of my charge, will raise a long mortgage against it at a fair rate from an honest lender, sufficient to meet the duties in full and repay it year by year out of the farm's own rents. Mr. Prentice has the figures, and the figures answer. Home Farm has carried £8,000 of debt on its back for 44 years without anyone noticing. It can carry the Crown for 20 more and buy itself free with its own harvests, which is more than any Whitfield ever managed for it. Item. The trust to have 3 trustees, and the deed names the first 3, Mr. Prentice, for the law, Sir Henry Whitfield, for the family, and his heirs after him, so that a Whitfield shall sit at that table and do the work and know, in every generation, whose money sits under the parish. And for the 3rd trustee, the deed says only this, the owner, for the time being, of the low meadow. Sir Henry read it. He read it slowly. Twice, his finger moving under the lines, and Ellen watched the understanding arrive, that he was not being destroyed, that he was not even being exiled, that he was being, of all things that he had dreaded, employed, given back a seat at the table of his own lost farm, beside the granddaughter of his steward, as her equal in trust and her junior in fact, forever. It was mercy. It was also, and every soul in the county would come to appreciate the workmanship of it. A sentence, the one sentence his kind had never in 180 years been made to serve, not ruin, responsibility. He signed. His hand shook, and he signed, and he looked up at her afterward with an expression Ellen never described to anyone, though Noah Tanner always swore, on no evidence whatever, that it was the look of a man let out of a debtor's prison he hadn't known he was in. Lady Whitfield had not spoken since the single word at the beginning. She spoke now. She was standing very straight by the cold hearth, and she was quite white. And 80 years of committee-trained carrying power had shrunk to something small and stripped, and she said, "Why? Your grandfather." "I understand." He was. She stopped and began again. "But you, after what why would you?" And Ellen Ward closed the clasp of the tin box and picked it up and considered the question honestly, because it was the first honest thing the woman had ever addressed to her. "Because he asked me to be kind where kindness is deserved," she said, "and I sat up 2 nights deciding whether you deserved it, and I decided you don't. But the parish does, and Sir Henry's children might, and my grandfather did, and this is his kindness, Lady Whitfield, not mine. I'm only the steward of it." She turned at the library door, because there was one thing left, and she had saved it deliberately. The way one saves the last entry that balances the page. She put her hand in her coat pocket and set a single coin on the long polished table, and it rang small in the great room, and spun and settled. "That's the shilling," Ellen said. "Count it twice, we're square." The Ashcombe Land Trust held its first meeting that Lady Day in the estate office, at the long counter where Samuel Ward had paid out wages for 40 years. The Crown was paid its duties in full and on time, out of a plain 20-year mortgage the trust raised upon Home Farm from an assurance society in Exeter, to be worked off season by season from the farm's own rents, so that the land, for the first time in its long history, was buying its own freedom with its own harvests. And the Bristol Syndicate went off and bought somewhere in Dorset and was heard of no more. The village learned the truth, the way villages learn everything, gradually, sideways, and then suddenly all at once. And when the whole shape of it finally stood clear in the parish's mind, the steward, the bank, the dead son's money, the 31 silent years, the hearthstone. Ashcombe took it in with a long, slow exhale, and folded it away into the deep places where a parish keeps its real possessions. Men took their hats off by the memorial cross who had walked past it bareheaded never for 30 years. Mrs. Cole cried in the shop, publicly, on 3 separate occasions, and defied anyone to make anything of it. And Noah Tanner, who had been told the whole story first, before the vicar, before anyone, sitting at Ellen's kitchen table with the tin open in front of him, filled his pipe with slow, ceremonious fingers, and was silent a long time, and said at last, "A man must bank somewhere. 30 year, I've puzzled at that." He looked at the hearthstone and shook his old head, and said, "And I stood on the bank the whole time." Ellen Ward lived at the steward's cottage for the rest of her life, and never married, and never left, and the county, which had called her the Swamp Girl for one summer, called her Miss Ward of the Low Meadow for 40 years, and sent its sons to her, hats in hands, to learn drainage and bookkeeping and the setting of true brick. The Low Meadow was never sold. It says so now in the trust's own deed, a special covenant, drafted dry as dust by Mr. Prentice, that whatever else the trust may buy or sell, the 11 acres called the Low Meadow shall remain with the heirs of Samuel Ward forever. It grows the best crops in the West Country, that black patient hoarded ground, and the river still pays its ancient rent onto it each winter through the hatches, and drains away each spring through brickwork more than a century old now, laid by a man who understood that a promise kept in the dark is worth 10 made in the daylight. And on winter evenings, when the floods are up beyond the Withies and the last light goes gray across the water, There is always a lamp lit in the kitchen window of the steward's cottage, above the hearthstone, where a tin box once waited 31 years in the dark. The village can see it from the church path. It means what such lights have always meant in that country, since the first stone was laid on stone. The keeper is in her keep. The account is balanced. And the lowland, exactly as the old man promised, turned out to be the best land in England. They sold it to her for a shilling. She gave the shilling back. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found something in Ellen's journey worth keeping, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might appreciate it. It helps our small channel continue to tell stories like this. And now we leave you with a question to ponder. Somewhere in most families, there is a Samuel Ward, someone whose quiet sacrifice was never spoken of, never repaid, perhaps never even discovered. Who was it in yours? Tell us their story in the comments. We read every one.